Welcome to the show, Dean.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure. Looking
No,
forward to chatting.
yeah, no problem. I wanted to bring you on today because I saw some of your stuff online, being a mind performance coach. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And I saw that you talk about four main topics, which are really interesting to me and I think will be helpful to my audience, which is procrastination, perfectionism, fear of public speaking, and fear of rejection. So they're all
Yes.
huge things that we all need to learn about. So I wanted to bring you on today because I wanted to talk about how we can shift some of our limiting beliefs and also our behaviors so we can achieve more in our fitness business.
Okay.
So first of all, just to get started, what do you believe is the number one fear that holds most business owners back?
I think it's actually for me it's a blend of two. So in the experience of coaching various people, it's a mix between fear of failure and fear of rejection, and both of those are underpinned and driven by a specific set of limiting beliefs, essentially. But they're largely based on this idea of what if. So what if it doesn't work out? What if I fail? And then ultimately the driver behind that is this idea that when we were born, we were only born with the fear of three things. So we're only essentially afraid of loud noises, falling, and being abandoned. And those are primal core fears. Anything else is a learned behavior. So any other fear is learned. But because abandonment is one of our primal core fears, anything that's linked to that has a real strong sense of primal fear. So when we talk about failure or rejection, that links back to being abandoned. This idea that, if I'm rejected, I'll be left outside of the group, I'll be left alone. And in the same way, if I fail to achieve something, then that can potentially lead me to being rejected or left outside of the group. And so they're all linked with this primal fear of being abandoned. And that's why they have such a strong play when both in our day-to-day life, but more importantly in business. I talk a lot about this idea that our beliefs, most of them, and we can touch on this later, but most of them are driven, we form them in our formative years. So having beliefs at age 5 or 6 generally doesn't affect us that much. But having the same belief that we had then when we're 20, 30 or 40 and we're in business is a major issue.
Yeah.
Especially depending on what it is, because it can, actually physically stop us from taking a specific action we know that we should be taking.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to fear of rejection or fear of abandonment, sometimes it could feel like we're afraid of being abandoned by potential clients, but really it's the result that can happen outside of your business. Like maybe your partner will reject you because you put everything on the line for this business and now it's not working out.
Yeah,
So
100%.
yeah.
And that feeds, if you like, our own self-doubt. It feeds the other limiting beliefs that we have about whether I'll be able to do this. Am I good enough? All of the primal limiting beliefs are fed by those fears on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. Okay. So where does this fear of abandonment, or you've kind of touched on this already, but where does it come from and how should we be responding when it shows up when we're trying to make decisions in our business?
I think the first thing to understand about limiting beliefs, so there's a perception that these beliefs, as I said, all beliefs are developed during our formative years. So usually by the time we're age 7, what most people refer to as our personality, which is effectively our self-image, the way we see ourselves, which is just driven by the beliefs that we have about the way the world should work and about how we see ourselves, they're all formed by the time we're 7 years old. And largely what happens is we then just look to validate those, in other words, to make sure that they appear real in the world for the rest of our lives. So from 7 to whatever age, we just continue to look in the world to say, is this true? Because this is what I believe to be true. And the problem with that is we have what's called confirmation bias, which means we only see the things that we believe to be true in the first place. So the number of times, and we've all experienced this, the number of times you are afraid of achieving something because you for whatever it is, a fear of rejection or one of the other limiting beliefs, maybe you feel that you're not good enough. If you look back during your life, there will have been times where you will have being able to demonstrate that you were good enough or that you did achieve something and you did have success. But they're largely ignored on the basis that we're only looking to prove our belief to be true in the first place. So I'm only interested in the things that prove that I'm not good enough, because they're the ones that I remember most. So all of those, they develop during those formative years. And the thing is, they don't necessarily always come from, traumatic events. There are traumatic events that can drive some of those beliefs, but that's not always the case. So, in my experience, you can work with people who have had, what was perceived to be a very good childhood, loving parents, middle or upper class family, they've had things. So it's not as if they've had a real traumatic childhood, yet they still have beliefs like I'm not good enough or people aren't interested in what I have to say. And the reason is that those beliefs, particularly the ones that affect our self-image or self-esteem, are formed from interactions with what we call caretakers. And essentially, that's anyone who is in a position of responsibility during that period of time. So it can be a parent, it could be a grandparent, it could be someone who's looking after you as an individual, as a child. But essentially, those interactions are what lead to the development of beliefs.
Right.
And they can be very simple things. So I'll give you an example using my own experience. So my eldest son, who has now gone on to develop his own career, but when he was first working, he started in a sales job, and that was my background. So he kind of followed in my footsteps. But he was really struggling at one point, and we sat down to talk about what did he think was what was holding him back. Mm-hmm. And his was an element of fear of rejection. It was around this idea that when he came to prospect, when he came to talk to potential new clients, he became really anxious about the outcome. He was worried whether or not they'd be interested, etc. And we narrowed it down to this idea that he had this belief that people wouldn't be interested in what he had to say to them. And when we looked back to where that belief came from and looked at what led to it, it was simply an interaction with me.
Oh.
During his young childhood, I spent most of my time working from a home office. I ran a sales team around the country, and so I spent a fair bit of time working virtually or remotely. And he would often come into what was my office or study at home with something, exciting to tell me, something he'd found in the garden or just something he was doing during the day. And my first reaction, as most of us would be in the current climate, would be, not now, I'm busy, I'm at work. Or now, the first time that happens, that's okay. But you imagine how many times over a 5-year period a young child asks for our attention and doesn't get it. That leads them to form this idea, because the children look at things in 3 ways very clearly. They look at, okay, the way that I feel now isn't that good. What leads to that feeling? And they do this unconsciously, not consciously, but they're effectively looking at, is it my father's fault that I feel like this? And invariably the answer to that is no, because in their eyes, we're all knowing. We're learning from them. Our parents know everything when we're young, and we're looking up to them. So it's not my fault. The second thing is, well, is it the environment? Is it the where I am that's at fault for making me feel this way? And invariably the answer to that is no, because I've experienced other emotions in this environment. And the third and final question is, well, maybe it's my fault then. And the answer to that always has to be, well, it must be, because I'm the only other person here. And so the internalization of that interpretation of that event becomes a belief over a period of time. So that's how they're formed, and that's how we end up with these fears in the first place, over and above our primal fears. When they show up, though, what most of us do is we try and find a way around it.
Right.
So, we've all looked at, or, what could I do in the short term that will help me get over this, or to get around it, to kind of put it in a box and leave it there so that I can get on doing what I'm doing. When really what we should be doing is what I call shining a light on it. We should bring it out in the open and put it on the table and say, okay, I'm afraid of this. Let me think about, where did that come from? Why am I actually afraid of this? And what's driving that in the first place? Because when you do that and you see things from a different perspective, invariably the fear just melts away, because it's like, well, but that's not possible. Why would he ever think that in a normal situation? But it's because it's driven by this reactive response to something that we've developed at such a young age.
Right. Yeah. So when it comes up, just ask yourself questions like, why am I feeling this way? What is this stemming from? Or is there a time in the past when I've experienced something similar to this? And just become inquisitive about it, right?
Absolutely. And a good question that I always say to clients to ask is this version of so what? When people, so I did a piece of work recently with someone who is actually a public speaker, so currently speaks on stages, or was on stage, but virtually, but still holds real anxiety, a real fear before they actually step out to be able to, perform. But when they're on stage, you would never see it. They're an amazing presenter. But we talked about this idea of, well, so what? If you feel like that before you go on, but you're amazing when you're on, so what? What's the problem? And it was like, well, there isn't so much a problem. I just don't want to feel like that. Okay, so what is it? So what is it that's driving you to feel like that? Mm-hmm. Well, it's this idea of, what if? Okay, so what if it happened? Mm-hmm. How would that make you feel? Mm-hmm. Well, it would make me feel like this. Okay, so what does that mean? And so this idea of so what, you can then drill down into exactly what's causing it and where did it come from. And then you can shine a light on it and see whether that's actually valid. Is that the truth?
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Most times it isn't.
Yeah, most of our fears are just irrational.
Yeah, made up usually.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk a bit about procrastination, because I know this is something that you speak about.
Yeah.
Why do we procrastinate on going after our goals, and what's the key to overcoming it? Big question.
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing that I try and get people to understand is some of these things like procrastination, like perfectionism, they're essentially just patterns of behavior. That's why they show up in all different parts of our life. And so there's a difference sometimes between somebody saying, I don't like doing this, so I put off doing it. And they then relate that to procrastination. Well, that's not necessarily procrastination. That might be just something you don't like doing. So there are parts of my business that I don't particularly like doing. I'd rather somebody else did them. So that's not necessarily procrastination. But if procrastination is an issue, it will show up in all aspects of your life. So you might not be going after your goals, but also you'll be putting off other things on a daily basis. It become a pattern for you over and over again. And when it's that, it is just a pattern of behavior. Now, I use an analogy to help people see what I mean about this. So every pattern of behavior is built on a set of beliefs, a specific set of beliefs. So you probably can't see, you can, it's just behind me there. There's a Jenga tower on the desk behind me, a wood block tower. And I use that as an analogy because if you imagine that any pattern of behavior like procrastination was a Jenga tower, it's built of a set of specific blocks. And if you took away the blocks of the Jenga tower, the tower would collapse. Mm-hmm. That's what happens with behavior patterns. If you understood what the blocks were for that pattern of behavior and you took the blocks away, the tower would collapse, the pattern of behavior would collapse, you wouldn't feel it anymore.
Right.
Now, the Jenga tower is also useful for two other analogies. The first thing is that people will say, well, I've done some work and I feel better. So I've done some personal development, or I've learned a new strategy, and things are improving. And usually that happens for a short period of time. And the reason for that is if you take a block out of that tower, it becomes unstable. So it changes how you feel effectively. You've changed the stability of the core behavior pattern.
Right.
But it still stands. It doesn't collapse. So you'll feel better for a while, but then it'll still repeat later on. So you might get 3 months, you might get 6 months, you might get 3 weeks. But eventually that pattern will repeat again because the tower, the pattern is still stood. Mm-hmm. The other thing I figured out, though, is that in the same way as a Jenga tower, is there are probably about 8 or 9 blocks in the Jenga tower that if you just removed those, the tower would still collapse. Right. And that's the same as us. So each of us, there are a specific set of beliefs that support that pattern of behavior. So for procrastination, there are probably, off the top of my head, I think there are 19 beliefs and 5 conditionings that support that pattern. But we as individuals might only have 8 or 10 or 12 of those based on our experiences and interactions. And so the key is to identify those, because then we're only working on the blocks that are going to collapse the tower in the shortest possible time.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's why sometimes, and I've experienced this personally, we go to events, for example, or we watch something online, or we listen to a speaker or a podcast, or we read a book, and then we see something and we're like, oh, I'm super motivated now, I know what I'm doing. And then it wanes after about 6 or 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And we're back to square one. And we think, oh, well, I need another injection of that then. I need another event to go to. And it just becomes this when-then mentality, which I always had for many years. When I've achieved this, or when I do this, or when I get this, then I'll feel better, or then I'll feel successful. And that's what drives it. So we end up in this roller coaster of up and down and up and down.
Right.
Because we're only removing parts of the pattern, and we never ever collapse the pattern completely. It always remains to some level until we do the work on those particular blocks, if you like, that support that pattern.
Yeah. And you see, I like what you said about going to an event and getting, hyped up. As there's so many events that are like personal development events, but they're all just about getting you jacked up and elated, and then do a little bit of work and then come crashing down a couple months later. And you need to keep doing the work. That's the key, right?
100%. Unless you're doing the work in the right place, because then you can have a bigger impact in the shortest possible time, because you're working on things that support patterns that are not serving you anymore. So there's a series of steps. There's, identify the patterns that aren't serving you, identify the blocks that support that pattern, identify your own personal code, if you like, the ones that are affecting you, and then work on them.
Yeah.
And then when we change that pattern, because effectively on that basis, we're making change at what most people perceive to be the identity level, because we're changing how we see ourselves. We're not changing who we are. I'm a big believer in this idea that coaching doesn't change people. Coaching reveals people.
Right. I like that.
Because who we are has never changed. The problem is that as we grow up, we put on these layers, if you like, that protect us from some of these beliefs that we have. So we develop a new belief, and we wear that as a suit of armor about who we are. So all we're doing from coaching is stripping back those to reveal the truth about who we are in the first place.
Yeah, I like that. That's powerful. Okay, let's talk about goal setting. Now, I saw somewhere you wrote that outdated processes like SMART goals don't work. And I thought that was very interesting, because that's the first time I've heard something about SMART goals. So can you explain that to me?
Yeah, so I've got this, I ended up with this kind of bee in my bonnet about some of these processes from some of the information I learned and also my own experience. I'm not saying that a goal setting process isn't important, because it is. The problem for me with SMART goals, and this way I say it's outdated, is yes, goals have to be specific. I agree entirely with that. And they need to be measurable. You need to know if you've achieved it ultimately, otherwise it's not a goal. So that's important, and it's true. The problem is in the next 3 sections of SMART goals, because for most people, the A stands for achievable or attainable.
Right.
Well, for me, if you're setting a goal that's achievable or attainable, then it's not really a goal. It's something you already know you can do, and you know how to do it. That I don't want people, when I'm working with clients, I don't want people setting goals like that. One of my mentors, Bob Proctor, said that, a goal should be something that scares and excites you at the same time. If you tell somebody that this is my goal and they kind of agree and nod their head and say, oh yeah, that I can see you achieving that, then it's not really a goal. You should tell people what you want to achieve, and they should either laugh or say, there's no way you can do that. For me, those are what goals are. So achievable and attainable doesn't work for me. And the next one, R, stands for realistic. Well, by whose standards?
Yeah.
How are we deciding what's realistic? I use examples, and I think, you look at some of the most amazing things that have been achieved in this world have been achieved by people who are dreaming about things that at first don't appear to be realistic. and you can go through the ages and look at that. It was unrealistic for Roger Bannister to run a mile in 4 minutes. The medical fraternity said, if you do that, if you complete that task, you will die. The body's not capable of doing that.
Wow.
It's unrealistic. And yet, from the second he did it, within weeks, there were several other people who broke the same time, because now we see it as being realistic. But the goal, the people who achieve amazing things are people who set unrealistic goals.
Right.
Things that they don't necessarily know how to do. They're just driven to achieve them. So that's the second reason I don't think it works. And the third and final reason is the T in SMART goals usually stands for time bound or timely. The problem is that, and I agree that we should be setting some level of goal, time frame, if you like, to achieve it. The problem is we're using it the wrong way. So what we do is we set a time frame to say, I must achieve the goal by then. This is my deadline. And if we don't, for whatever reason, then we discard the goal. We say, oh, I didn't achieve it in that time. So the thing about goal achievement is there's a law, again, this is from one of my mentors, but there's a law called the law of gender, which is it's not about male, female. It's about gestation periods. And the law states that every seed has a specific gestation period. So if you wanted to plant corn, you could actually go somewhere at the minute. There is somebody in the world who knows what the exact gestation period is for corn, from when you plant the seed to when it produces its physical product at the end. There's a specific time frame for that, and people know what that is. The problem is usually for goals or ideas, the gestation period from the seed of the idea to its physical manifestation, nobody knows what that time frame is. So whilst we need a time frame in order to drive us, and that's more for me about driving our reticular and our actions and behaviors, we shouldn't be saying, oh, well, if I don't achieve it by then I'll never achieve it, because we don't know what that gestation period is. So I often say, and I say it in my events, that I've achieved every single goal I've ever set myself. And people will say, well, that's not possible, because surely you've got things that you've set yourself that you haven't yet achieved. Yes, but that doesn't mean I haven't achieved them. It just means they haven't physically manifested themselves, because I don't know what the gestation period is. They will come to fruition. I can't tell when, but they will. I'm 100% certain of it, because that's a law. So long as I keep doing the actions and behaviors towards it, for enough time, it will happen. The biggest thing for me is not that people don't set their goals too high. It's either that they set them too low because they're achievable or realistic, or they give up if they don't achieve them in the time frame they thought they should have done. That's why we don't achieve most of our goals. It's not that we don't have the skills, capability, or resources to do it. It's that we either don't go for long enough to achieve it, or we set the goal far too low for what is potentially capable for us.
Right. And I like what you said with the A, which is, I think, achievable, right? That's based on your own perception about what your limitations are. So
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, you can really.
Yeah, absolutely. We're already setting something which is limited by what we believe we're capable of.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. So what are 3 to 5 action steps that we can add into our daily routine to help set ourselves up for success and prepare ourselves for any challenges that might arise?
Okay, I really like this question. So the first thing I'd say is something to do before you do it as a daily activity. But in my experience, most people don't have a real clear vision for what it is that they want. And it goes back to this idea of, so it's another question for me, is that when I'm working with someone, I'll say to them, what is it you want to achieve? They'll tell me, and then I ask them why. Because ultimately what we want to achieve is not the reason we're doing it. And often when you drill down far enough, you find something completely different about what it is that they want to do. And so I often work through a process with people to define and write out exactly what it is that they want in as much detail as we can. It's something that if you've read Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, he calls a definite major purpose, a definite chief aim. It's this one thing that's driving you based on all the things that you do effectively.
Right.
Now, it doesn't just have to be one single thing, like I want to make this much money or I want to be this sort of person. It can be a mix of those things, but it's written down in a statement that says, this is effectively who I am and what I have and what I do. All about who we are. When you have that clarity, then my first daily thing is you should be reading that out every morning and every evening. Because it's the thing that is driving you, and it's your constant reminder of, this is why I get out of bed. Right. This is why I do what I do on a daily basis. And this is what drives me. And I have various copies of them. I have one right in front of me on my desk so that I can see it the second I sit down in the morning. I have a version of it on my phone so that I can look at it. And the other thing is I've been doing it for long enough now, but I effectively memorize it so that my first waking thought is to run through that.
Wow. Okay.
I kind of see it to myself. And it's all written in the present tense. It's not, this is what I will be. It's, this is who I am. This is what I do on a daily basis. So that'd be my first daily thing to do. The second daily thing is to use what I call triggers to help keep that front of mind.
Okay.
And that can be anything at all. It's different for different people. Some people will use vision boards. I have one in my office. Some people will use the written statement, if you like. For me personally, I do have vision boards and things in the office, so visual triggers in the office. But outside of that, I use two things. I have a playlist which is linked for me on the visuals of that achievement, all of the things that kind of meet those little things that you go along. It's maybe only 7 or 8 songs long, but every time I hear those songs, it reminds me of that. So I use that playlist as a trigger. And then I also have what's called a goal card, which is essentially just a business card, something the size of a business card, which has a very shortened version of my definite major purpose written on it. And I carry that everywhere with me. It's now a little bit old and tattered, so if I showed you it, you would be able to see what I mean, because I carry it, so it's kind of a little bit worn and now, but I carry it everywhere. And in the early days, it was used whenever I had an opportunity. I would take it from my pocket and I would read it, and then it drives the visuals and the images and the emotions that go with it. Just the act of having it now is like a trigger, a constant reminder that I know it's there with me all the time, and it keeps that front of mind. So those are two things on a daily basis. The third thing for me, the final thing, is based around perspective. So when we change the way we look at something, what we look at changes. And the number of times we see things as being difficult or a challenge or an obstacle, and if we changed the way we looked at it, it would be different. Now, I'll give you an example of this from a sports perspective. It's an analogy that I use quite often, even for business people, is that if you imagine being at the start line of 110-meter hurdles, when all of the competitors look up, all they see are hurdles, a series of obstacles. The difference for me between those who achieve and those who struggle are most people see those hurdles as being in the way, whereas the more successful people see them as being on the way.
Right.
So every time something appears on a daily basis, I run that scenario through my head. Is this obstacle, is it in my way, or is it just on my way to where I want to be?
I love that.
And if it's just on the way, then I can get over it, round it, through it, or whatever. If it's in the way, I don't see what's beyond it. I stop there. It blocks me there. And I use a personal example that in 2008 and 9, you shared in my bio, I went through a period where we built a successful business, my wife and I, then we lost it, and we were nearly killed in a car accident, and I ended up bankrupt. During that period of time, everything I saw was in the way.
Yeah.
I saw no way through around anything. Everything was a problem. It was a challenge. And the problem with that is we end up in this downward spiral. It takes us down. Our thinking, we catastrophize our thinking. We end up in the worst case scenario. But in the same time frame, so I blamed everything, the economy, the financial crisis, everything. But in that same time frame between 2008 and 2009, there were people who launched companies which are now billion-dollar brands.
Right.
It cannot be the economy. It couldn't be the time frame. They just saw that as being, well, that's just the way it is. It's on the way to where we need to be. Something we've got to come across. There's a great saying by the late great Jim Rohn, which is the same wind blows on us all. It's not the blowing of the wind that determines our destination. It's the set of the sail. And it's a great way to look at, okay, if this is the way the wind's blowing, I just need to set my sail. Because that's going to, that's how I traverse to where I need to be.
Right.
And so for me, that's the other thing on a daily basis. It's looking at everything. Every time something comes up, one of these challenges, because there will be, there's always something, is to look at it about, is it in my way or is it on the way? And the other thing, the way to look at it is, instead of saying, why me? I did a lot of why me over the years. Why is this happening to me? I now start to say, what is this trying to teach me? Why do I need to know this lesson? And what I've realized is, it's not always trying to teach me something for me. Sometimes it's trying to teach me something for somebody else.
Right.
And I don't necessarily know who that is or why that is until it happens. So sometimes things happen in our lives and people will say, well, you would never be able to say that's good. When I look back at the car accident, people would say, well, you could never say that was a good thing. But actually, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for that. So you can't join the dots looking forward. You can only join them looking back. But having the knowledge, the knowing that this is happening for a reason. Who knows what that reason is right now? I can't tell. But it is happening for a reason. Knowing that alleviates and changes the way you look at some of the decisions you make during that period of your life, that season of your life.
Right.
And that perspective allows you to shift some of those things.
I love it. Was it three amazing ways to get, I think it's about having the right perspective, like setting your perspective right at the start of the day.
Yeah.
I really like what you said about reading through your mission or whatever you want to call it, or your purpose at the start of the day. This is something I need to remember to do. I do have mine written on the wall over here. I think that's a really great way to remind yourself about, you're going to have to make a lot of decisions throughout the day, right? And having this front of mind is going to help to lead you in the right path.
100%. Yeah. I have a quote that sits behind me on the wall, which was from Denzel Washington, that says, don't aspire to make a living, aspire to make a difference. And it's there because, part of my purpose is about making a difference. And so it's to remind me on a daily basis that everything I do makes a difference to somebody, somewhere. And you can't always see that, but it helps when I'm in a situation where somebody asks me to do something, and I think, I don't know if I'm in the right frame of mind to do that today, or it just reminds me of looking back at what maybe somebody needs to hear that. That's for me saying, I'm not in the right frame. That's me being selfish. That's me looking at me. What if I look about what about the difference I could make to somebody else in that moment? And that's what kind of drives me again to say, okay, I need to do this. I need to get back on. I've been asked to do something for a reason.
Yeah, I love that. And it just reminds me of something I teach my clients a lot. Is even if you put a post up on social media that doesn't get a very good response, in your opinion, it doesn't mean that you should take it down or you should be embarrassed of it or anything, because that is a message that someone needed to hear, just like what you said.
100%. And I've had this personally, my own personal experience, and I say this to all my clients as well, is that the number of times I have people who I've met face to face who said to me, do you know what? I absolutely love the content that you post. And I've said, well, you've never interacted. But what that tells me is that's about their belief system. So they may be in a position where they don't want to like or comment on it because that will show other people, something about them. So you can't tell where people are in their life and what stops them taking action, but know that you're having an impact.
Definitely. All right, this has been so helpful, Dean. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about your masterclass here, because I know that this is something that you do. So you've got the floor.
Okay, thank you. So this was born out of the fact that, like, I used to run a lot of live events, which we can't do right now. And so, in the vein of, what is this teaching me and what am I supposed to learn? COVID stopped us being able to do face-to-face live events. But what it taught me was that I can still offer some value and we can impact more people around the world if we do it virtually. And so looking at it positively, that's what we tried to do. So the 3-hour masterclass is essentially a hybrid. It's not like a webinar. It's more like a live event.
Right.
So I deliver it in that way, and it's interactive. So although it's free, we try and restrict the numbers to enough that we can have some level of interaction. But it covers some of the things we've touched on today. So a bit around goal setting, why SMART goals don't work, how to use a different synonym to be able to drive your goal achievement, more on the laws of goal achievement rather than goal setting. So I focus on helping people become what I call goal getters instead of goal setters. And then some more detail around how we think, how the mind really works, more around the mindset and the belief systems, and how that impacts our lives and how we can change that. And it's delivered over 3 hours. I've got one coming up at the end of June, and it's free. People can come along and spend 3 hours, and it's designed for there to be enough value for people to take information from it and go and use them. Action it, even if they don't do any further work with me whatsoever. That's what it was about. It does two things. It gives me an opportunity to connect with more people, but it also fulfills my purpose of making a difference and having an impact somewhere around the world on a regular basis.
Right. And that's at deanafox.com, correct?
Yes, people can book their place directly there for free at deanafox.com.
Okay. And social media, where can you be found?
Yeah, so I'm on all the main social channels, so Instagram, Facebook, Clubhouse. All my handles are the same. It's at Dean Fox Coaching. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Dean, for your time. This has been such a valuable episode. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Sally, for having me. I'm always blessed and grateful to have a chance to share something because, and I say this genuinely, it may not be anything that I've said today. It may have been something that you said, but we may have come along at the right time for somebody and we may have made a difference.
True. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.